The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Dust Creek, Wyoming territory. It was the summer of 1875, and the heat shimmered off the wooden buildings like water on hot iron. Jonas Miller squinted against the glare as he rode into town, his bay gelding's hooves kicking up small clouds of dirt with each step. At 32, Jonas cut a solitary figure against the harsh landscape. His weathered face bore the marks of too many days under the unforgiving sun, and his gray eyes held a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The former cavalry soldier sat straight in his saddle, a habit that years of civilian life hadn't broken. His ranch, if you could call 20 head of cattle in a ramshackle cabin a ranch, lay 15 miles north of town, but necessity had driven him here today. "Afternoon, Miller," called out Sam Henderson from the porch of his general store. The portly merchant fanned himself with yesterday's newspaper, sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade. Jonas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement but didn't stop. He had business at the Broken Wheel Saloon, though not the kind most men sought there. He needed a cook for the summer cattle drive, and his options were running thin. The saloon's bat-wing doors swung behind him as he entered, the sudden dimness a relief from the blazing sun. The place was nearly empty at this hour, save for a few ranch hands nursing warm beers and old Jake Turner sleeping off last night's whiskey in the corner. "Well, if it ain't Jonas Miller," drawled Tom Garrett, the bartender, his thick mustache twitching with amusement. "Don't often see you in here during daylight hours. Or any hours, come to think of it." "Need information, Tom?" Jonas leaned against the bar, declining the offered drink with a slight shake of his head. "I'm looking for a cook." Tom's laugh was short and sharp. "Good luck with that. Every outfit for 50 miles is looking for the same thing. Cookie Johnson up and died last month, and young Billy Tate can barely boil water without burning it." "Heard there might be someone over in Millbrook," Jonas said, his voice steady and low. "Goes by the name Sarah Callahan." The change in the saloon was immediate and palpable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even old Jake stirred in his stupor. Tom's face went from amused to concerned in the space of a heartbeat. "You don't want to go messing with that one." "Jonas," Tom said, lowering his voice. "That's the wildest woman this side of the Missouri. They say she pulled a knife on the last man who got too familiar, near about carved him up like a Christmas turkey." "I need a cook, not a wife," Jonas replied evenly. One of the ranch hands, a young cowboy named Pete Hawkins, turned on his stool. "My cousin worked at the Double Bar Ranch when she was there. Said she threw a whole pot of stew at the foreman when he complained about the seasoning. Got herself run out of town within a week." "That's nothing," added another man, older and grizzled. "I heard she shot at a man in Colorado just for suggesting she couldn't handle camp life. Woman's got a temper hotter than hell's hinges and a tongue sharper than a Bowie knife." Jonas absorbed this information without expression. He'd learned long ago that tales grew taller with each telling, especially when they concerned women who didn't fit the mold. "She can cook, though." Tom nodded reluctantly. "Oh, she can cook all right. Best food you ever tasted, they say, but she won't take orders from no man. Won't be told what to do. And sure as shooting won't act like a proper lady. That's why she can't keep a position nowhere." "Where can I find her?" The bartender shook his head. "Jonas, you're a good man. You keep to yourself. Pay your debts. Don't cause trouble. Why would you want to bring that kind of chaos into your life?" "Because I've got 6 cowboys who need feeding for a 2-month drive, and I leave in a week." Jonas straightened, adjusting his gun belt out of habit. "Where is she?" "Tom." "Last I heard, she was working at Ma Peterson's boarding house in Millbrook, but that was 2 weeks ago. Knowing her reputation, she's probably been shown the door by now." Jonas nodded his thanks and turned to leave. Behind him, he heard Pete Hawkins say, $10 says she shoots him before he gets 2 words out. 20 says he don't even make it to Millbrook before coming to his senses." Another voice chimed in. The afternoon sun hadn't lessened its assault when Jonas emerged from the saloon. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle with practiced ease. Millbrook was a half-day's ride east, which meant he'd be traveling through the night to get back. But good cooks were scarcer than water in August, and Jonas had learned in the cavalry that sometimes you had to take calculated risks. As he rode out of Dust Creek, Jonas reflected on his situation. The ranch was barely holding together as it was. He'd sunk every penny of his discharge pay into the land and cattle, leaving nothing for hired help beyond the bare minimum. The other ranchers could afford to be picky about their camp cooks, but Jonas didn't have that luxury. If this Sarah Callahan could cook and was willing to work, he'd take his chances with her temperament. The trail to Millbrook wound through sagebrush and rocky outcroppings, the landscape painted in shades of brown and gray. Jonas's mind wandered to the warnings he'd received. A woman who wouldn't take orders, who fought back when pushed, who refused to bend to expectations. In his experience, such people were either trouble or exactly what you needed when trouble came calling. The sun was setting by the time Jonas reached Millbrook, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The town was smaller than Dust Creek, just a main street with a few businesses and houses scattered around. Ma Peterson's boarding house sat at the end of the street, a 2-story building that had seen better days. Jonas tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps to the front door. Through the window, he could see the dining room, where several boarders were gathered around a long table. The smell that wafted out made his stomach growl fresh bread, roasted meat, and something with cinnamon. Ma Peterson answered his knock, a stout woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. "We're full up, mister. No rooms available." "I'm not looking for a room, ma'am. I'm looking for Sarah Callahan. I heard she might be working here." Ma Peterson's expression soured. "What's she done now?" "Nothing, ma'am. I'm here to offer her employment." The older woman studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "She's in the kitchen, but I warn you, Mr. Miller, Jonas Miller." "Mr. Miller. Then, I warn you, that girl is nothing but trouble. She's got skill, I'll give her that. But she's got a mouth on her that could strip paint off a barn and a disposition that make a rattlesnake seem friendly. I was planning to let her go at week's end anyway." Jonas followed Ma Peterson through the dining room, where conversation stopped as the boarders took in the sight of the tall, dust-covered stranger. The kitchen door swung open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. A woman stood at the stove, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a kerchief, her sleeves rolled up to reveal freckled forearms. She moved with fierce efficiency, stirring one pot while flipping something in a skillet with her other hand. Her face was flushed from the heat, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. But her green eyes were sharp and focused. "Sarah," Ma Peterson said, her tone frosty. "There's a man here to see you." Sarah Callahan turned, and Jonas found himself under the scrutiny of those green eyes. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 25, with a face that was more striking than conventionally pretty. There was something wild about her, something that reminded him of an unbroken Mustang, beautiful, dangerous, and utterly unpredictable. "If you're here about the incident with Mr. Brewster, he had it coming," Sarah said, her voice carrying a slight Irish lilt. "Man puts his hands where they don't belong. He gets a skillet to the head. That's just natural consequences." "I'm here to offer you a job," Jonas said simply. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What kind of job?" "Cook for my cattle outfit. 2 months on the trail, good pay, and nobody'll bother you as long as you keep the men fed." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And why would you want to hire me? I'm sure Ma Peterson here has filled your ears with tales of what a terrible, unwomanly creature I am." "Can you cook?" "Better than anyone in this territory," she said without modesty. "Can you handle camp life?" "I've been handling whatever life throws at me since I was 12 years old." "Mr. Miller, Jonas Miller." Mr. Miller. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving streaks of flour. The question is, can you handle having a woman in your camp who won't curtsy and simper and pretend to be less than she is? Jonas met her gaze steadily. I need a cook, Miss Callahan. I don't need curtsying or simpering. I need someone who can feed 6 cowboys 3 meals a day without poisoning them or burning everything to char. Can you do that? For the first time since he'd entered the kitchen, Sarah's expression softened slightly. When do we leave? 5 days. You'll need to be in Dust Creek by then. The pay, $40 a month plus found. It was a fair wage, and they both knew it. Sarah untied her apron and handed it to Ma Peterson, who looked relieved to see it go. I'll be there, Mr. Miller, but I have conditions. Name them. I bunk separately from the men. I carry my own weapons. And if any of your cowboys gets ideas above his station, I handle it my way. Agreed. As long as your way doesn't involve killing any of my hands. No promises, Sarah said, but there was a hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. I'll see you in Dust Creek. Mr. Miller. Jonas touched the brim of his hat and left, aware of the weight of Sarah's gaze on his back. Outside, night had fully fallen, and the stars were beginning to appear in the vast Wyoming sky. As he mounted his horse for the long ride home, Jonas wondered if he'd just solved his problem or created a dozen new ones. Time would tell. But one thing was certain: the summer drive was going to be anything but ordinary with Sarah Callahan in camp. The ride back to his ranch gave Jonas plenty of time to think. He'd survived the war, survived battles with the Sioux and Cheyenne, survived the bitter loneliness that came with starting over in a harsh land. Surely he could survive one wild Irish cook. But as he rode through the darkness, following trails he knew by heart, Jonas couldn't shake the memory of those fierce green eyes and the challenge they held. Sarah Callahan was trouble. That much was certain. The question was whether she was the kind of trouble that would save him or destroy him. Only time would tell. The morning Sarah Callahan arrived at Jonas Miller's ranch, she did so in style, which is to say, in a way that immediately set tongues wagging and established her reputation before she'd even unpacked her belongings. She drove up in a rickety wagon pulled by a mule that looked as ornery as its owner, dust swirling around them like a miniature tornado. The cowboys, who'd been mending fences near the main trail, stopped their work to stare. It wasn't just that a woman was driving alone, though that was unusual enough. It was the way she handled the cantankerous mule, cursing it creatively in what sounded like a mixture of English and Gaelic when it tried to veer off the path. "Sweet mother of pearl," muttered Charlie Dawson, the youngest of Jonas's hands at barely 19. "Is that our new cook?" "Must be," replied Frank Cooper, an older cowboy with sun-weathered skin and a permanent squint. "Though she looks more like she's come to start a war than cook supper." Sarah pulled the wagon up to the ranch house, if you could dignify the collection of rough-hewn buildings with such a name. She set the brake, jumped down with surprising grace considering her heavy skirts, and surveyed her new domain with the critical eye of a general inspecting a battlefield. Jonas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been shoeing horses since dawn, and the familiar work had kept his mind off the approaching storm, for that's how he'd come to think of Sarah Callahan's arrival. "Miss Callahan," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Miller." She nodded curtly, then gestured at the outdoor kitchen setup near the bunkhouse. "That's where you expect me to perform miracles, is it?" Jonas followed her gaze to the simple arrangement: a cast-iron stove under a lean-to, a rough table, some shelves, and a collection of pots and pans that had seen better days. "It's basic, but functional," he said. "Basic," Sarah laughed, a sound like whiskey and smoke. "I've seen better kitchens in mining camps." She strode over to inspect the setup more closely, lifting pot lids, checking the stove's chimney, and making small noises of disapproval. "This won't do at all. I'll need a proper work table, more shelves, and something to keep the supplies out of the dust and critters." "I'll see what we can do," Jonas said carefully. Sarah turned to face him, hands on her hips. "You'll see, Mr. Miller. Do you want your men fed properly or not? Because I can't work miracles with equipment that belongs in a scrap heap." Before Jonas could respond, the rest of his crew had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Besides Charlie and Frank, there was Hank Williams, a former Buffalo soldier with arms like tree trunks, Elijah Ely Porter, whose skill with horses was matched only by his ability to complain, and Red McCurdy, whose hair had once justified the nickname but was now more gray than crimson. "Boys," Jonas said, "this is Miss Callahan, our cook for the drive." The men shuffled their feet, clearly unsure how to react. They'd all heard the stories by now. Tom Garrett at the Broken Wheel had made sure of that. Sarah looked them over with the same critical eye she'd applied to the kitchen. "I suppose you'll do," she said finally. "Though, you," she pointed at Charlie, "need to eat more. You're skinnier than a fence post. And you," this to Eli, "stop looking like someone shot your favorite dog. I promise my cooking won't kill you, despite what you might have heard." "Ma'am," Eli ventured, "we heard you threw a pot of stew at your last boss." "Only because he threw his opinions about women where they didn't belong first," Sarah replied crisply. "Fair's fair. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I need to make this disaster of a kitchen into something workable. Supper's at 6, don't be late." The men scattered, but Jonas noticed them sneaking glances back at the new cook as she began unloading her wagon. Along with the expected bags and boxes, she pulled out a rifle, a shotgun, and what looked suspiciously like a skinning knife that could double as a small sword. "Expecting trouble, Miss Callahan?" Jonas asked. "Always, Mr. Miller. That's how you avoid being surprised by it." She hefted a flour sack over her shoulder with surprising strength. "Now, are you going to stand there gawking, or are you going to help me unload?" Jonas found himself moving to help before he'd consciously decided to do so. There was something about Sarah Callahan that made you want to either run for the hills or fall in line. Since running wasn't an option, this was his ranch. After all, he grabbed a crate of supplies. Over the next few hours, Sarah transformed the crude outdoor kitchen into something approaching functionality. She bullied Charlie and Red into building additional shelves, commanded Hank to move the stove to a better position, and somehow convinced the perpetually grumbling Eli to string up a canvas cover to provide more shade. Jonas watched this whirlwind of activity from the corral, where he was working with a young stallion, his men, who usually required direct orders and sometimes threats to do anything beyond their regular duties, were scurrying around like ants under Sarah's direction. "She's something, ain't she?" Frank commented, joining Jonas at the fence. "That's one way to put it." Jonas replied, "The boys are taking bets on how long she'll last. And Charlie gives her a week. Eli says 3 days. I'm more optimistic. I said 2 weeks. Frank spat tobacco juice into the dust. "What's your wager, boss?" Jonas watched as Sarah demonstrated to Red the proper way to arrange the supply shelves, her gestures animated and her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'm betting she'll outlast all of us," he said quietly. Frank chuckled. "You might be right at that. Woman who can get Eli Porter to work without complaining has got to have some kind of magic." As the sun climbed higher, the temperature soared. The men returned to their regular duties, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation. Everyone was waiting for 6 o'clock to see if Sarah Callahan's cooking lived up to her reputation or if they'd be choking down another summer of beans and hardtack. At 5:30, smells began emanating from the kitchen that had every man on the ranch finding excuses to work closer to the bunkhouse. The aroma of baking bread mingled with something savory and rich, and Jonas saw Charlie actually stop mid-swing with his hammer, nose lifted to the air like a hunting dog. "Whatever she's making, it sure beats Frank's attempt at stew last week," Hank said, passing by with a saddle that needed mending. Hey, my stew wasn't that bad, Frank protested. Frank, your stew could have been used to patch holes in the roof, Red called out, earning a round of laughter from the others. At 6 o'clock sharp, Sarah rang the dinner bell, a new addition she'd somehow procured and hung from a post near the kitchen. The men converged on the area like iron filings to a magnet, but stopped short when they saw the spread. Instead of the usual pot of beans and pan of cornbread, there was a Dutch oven full of beef stew that actually looked like stew instead of brown water with suspicious lumps. Fresh biscuits golden from the oven. Beans that had been seasoned with something more than hope. And miracle of miracles, a pot of coffee that didn't smell like it had been made with ditch water. Don't just stand there with your mouths open, Sarah said, hands on her hips. Food's getting cold. The men didn't need a second invitation. They fell on the meal like wolves. And for several minutes, the only sounds were those of eating and occasional groans of appreciation. Miss Sarah, Charlie said finally, his plate already empty. This is the best meal I've had since I left my mama's house. Don't get used to it, Sarah replied, but Jonas noticed she looked pleased. Trail cooking won't be this fancy, but I promise you'll eat better than you have been. She looked pointedly at the corner where a pot of Frank's abandoned stew attempt still sat. Much better. After supper, the men lingered, something they rarely did. Usually, they wolfed down their food and scattered to their evening pursuits cards, maintenance, or early sleep. But tonight, they sat around the table Sarah had commanded them to build, nursing cups of coffee and watching their new cook clean up with the same efficiency she'd shown in preparing the meal. Miss Callahan, Eli ventured. Where'd you learn to cook like this? Sarah paused in her scrubbing. Here and there. Started cooking in a boarding house when I was 13. Worked my way through hotels, restaurants, and more ranch kitchens than I care to count. Why'd you leave them all? Red asked. Then quickly added, if you don't mind my asking. Sarah's smile was sharp as her skinning knife. Most places, men think a woman in the kitchen is also on the menu. I had to teach them different. Management rarely appreciated my teaching methods. An uncomfortable silence fell. These men knew the type she meant. They'd all worked with cowboys who thought any woman was fair game, especially one without a husband or father to protect her. Well, Jonas said, standing. Any man here who forgets his manners will answer to me, and then to Miss Callahan. I suspect her punishment would be worse. Considerably, Sarah agreed cheerfully. Now, shoo! I've got prep work for tomorrow, and you're all in my way. As the men dispersed, Jonas lingered. That was a fine meal, Miss Callahan. It was adequate, she corrected. Wait until I get proper supplies and figure out this temperamental stove. Then you'll see what I can really do. She studied him for a moment. You're not what I expected. Mr. Miller. What did you expect? The usual. A man who hired me out of desperation but would spend the whole time trying to put me in what he thinks is my place. She dried her hands on her apron. Instead, you've barely said 10 words to me all day. I learned in the cavalry that the best leaders know when to stay out of the way of people who know their job better than you do. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Cavalry, was it? That explains the ramrod spine and the way you handle your men. How long were you in? 6 years. Mustered out in 71. And traded one hard life for another. It wasn't a question. It's a life, Jonas said simply. Better than some. They stood there for a moment. 2 people who'd chosen difficult paths and bore the scars to prove it. Then Sarah broke the spell by turning back to her dishes. Breakfast is at 5. She said, tell your boys not to be late. I don't serve stragglers. Jonas touched his hat and walked away, but not before catching her reflection in a pot. She was watching him go, her expression thoughtful. That night, as Jonas made his final rounds, he overheard his men talking in the bunkhouse. I take it back, Charlie was saying. I bet she makes it the whole drive. Don't know, Eli countered. She's got skills, sure, but this was just one day. Wait until we're on the trail. Dust and everything, water scarce, and tempers short. You're just sore because she called you out. Red laughed. Admit it, you haven't eaten that well in years. The food was good. Eli conceded, but mark my words, a woman like that is trouble. She's too... He searched for the word. Too much herself. Jonas moved away from the bunkhouse. Considering Eli's words, yes, Sarah Callahan was very much herself, unapologetically so. In a frontier that tried to squeeze women into narrow roles, she refused to be diminished. That was indeed trouble. The question was for whom. As he settled into his own narrow bed, Jonas thought about the coming drive. 50 head of cattle, 6 cowboys, 2 months on the trail, and 1 wild Irish cook who'd already turned his quiet ranch into something resembling controlled chaos. He'd hired her for her cooking skills, but Jonas had a feeling Sarah Callahan was going to change more than just their meals. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, it wouldn't be boring. The storm came out of nowhere, as summer storms in Wyoming often did. One moment the sky was clear, the next, black clouds rolled in from the west like an advancing army. Jonas had seen the signs, the way the cattle grew restless, the sudden drop in temperature, the peculiar yellow tinge to the light, but they were too far from the main camp to make it back in time. "Storm coming in fast," he called to Sarah, who was gathering buffalo chips for the evening fire. They'd been out scouting for water sources for tomorrow's drive. Just the two of them, while the men moved the herd to fresh grazing. Sarah straightened, shading her eyes as she studied the sky. "That's going to be a bad one," she said, her voice calm despite the circumstances. How far to shelter? Jonas pointed to a line of cottonwoods about a half-mile distant. "There's an old line shack near those trees. We can make it if we hurry." They mounted quickly, Sarah handling her borrowed horse with more skill than Jonas had expected, and rode hard for the shelter. The wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across their path, and the first fat raindrops began to fall as they reached the trees. The line shack was little more than a rough cabin, built years ago by some forgotten rancher for shelter during roundups. The roof was mostly intact, and the walls would keep out the worst of the weather. Jonas pushed open the door, checking quickly for current inhabitants, both animal and human, before ushering Sarah inside. "Home, sweet home," Sarah said dryly, taking in the dusty interior. There was a crude fireplace, a wooden platform that might charitably be called a bunk, and not much else. The storm hit in earnest as Jonas secured the horses in the lean-to attached to the shack. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the ground, and lightning turned the world white for seconds at a time. By the time he made it back inside, he was soaked to the skin. Sarah had already started a fire in the fireplace using some old wood stacked in the corner and the matches she always carried. The orange glow pushed back the gloom, creating a small circle of warmth and light. "You're dripping on my floor," she said, though her tone was more amused than annoyed. "Your floor." Jonas removed his hat, shaking water from it. "I've claimed it, possession being 9/10 of the law and all that." She rummaged in her saddlebags and pulled out a cloth. "Here, dry off before you catch your death." Jonas accepted the cloth gratefully. Outside, the storm raged, rain hammering against the walls like bullets. The shack creaked and groaned but held firm. "Well," Sarah said, settling herself on the floor near the fire, "this is cozy. Nothing like being trapped in a shack with your boss during the storm of the century." "It'll blow over in a few hours," Jonas said, though he wasn't entirely sure. These summer storms could last minutes or days. "I'm not complaining," Sarah said. "Better than being out in that." Lightning flashed, illuminating her face for a moment. "Besides, I've been in worse places with worse company." Jonas found himself sitting down across from her, the fire between them. It was the first time they'd been alone together. Really alone, since she'd arrived at the ranch 2 weeks ago. On the trail. There were always the men around, the cattle to tend, the 1,000 tasks that needed doing. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said after a while. Jonas nodded. "Why did you really hire me? And don't say it was just because you needed a cook. You could have found someone else. Someone who didn't come with a reputation." Jonas considered his words carefully. "Maybe I figured anyone who could survive in this business while being true to themselves had to be tougher than most. Or maybe you just like taking in strays." Sarah suggested, "I've seen how you are with the men. Charlie told me you hired him when no one else would because he'd been in trouble. And Hank, not every outfit would take on a former Buffalo soldier." "Good men are hard to find." Jonas said simply, "Doesn't matter where they come from or what color their skin is, long as they do their work." "And women. Good cooks are even harder to find." Sarah laughed, a genuine sound that filled the small space. "Practical. I like that." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. In the firelight, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "You want to know something funny? This is the longest I've held a job in 2 years. Why do you think that is?" "Because you leave me alone to do my work. You don't hover, don't question every decision. Don't act like I'm about to steal the silver or burn down the camp." She paused. "Also, you don't look at me like I'm something on the menu instead of the person cooking it." Jonas felt heat in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "That's just basic decency." "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Sarah's voice turned bitter. "My last employer, the one with the stew incident, he cornered me in the pantry. Said I should be nicer to him if I wanted to keep my position. I was nice, all right. Nice enough to only hit him with the pot instead of the cleaver." Anger flared in Jonas's chest, hot and sudden. "He had no right." "No, he didn't. But men like that think they have rights to whatever they want." Sarah met his eyes across the fire. "That's why I carry the knife, and the gun, and why I have what you might call a reputation." Thunder crashed overhead, making them both jump. The rain intensified, if that was possible, turning into a solid wall of water. The firelight flickered as wind found cracks in the walls. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "What's a former cavalry officer doing running a 2-bit cattle operation in the middle of nowhere?" Jonas was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "You ever do something you can't take back? Something that changes you so fundamental that you can't go back to who you were before?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Once or twice. The cavalry. It wasn't what I thought it would be. I joined up thinking I'd be protecting settlers, keeping the peace. Instead." He stared into the fire. "There was a village, Cheyenne. We were told they were hostiles, but when we got there, it was mostly women and children. Old men. The order came to—" He stopped, unable to continue. "You don't have to tell me," Sarah said softly. "I refused the order, told my men to stand down. My commanding officer tried to relieve me of command, and I drew my weapon on a superior officer. Would have shot him if he'd pushed it." Jonas's hands clenched and unclenched. "They court-martialed me. Should have hanged me, but I had men who testified on my behalf. Discharged instead, with just enough pay to start over somewhere far away." The only sound was the storm and the crackling fire. Then Sarah said, "You did the right thing." "Did I? Sometimes I wonder if another officer would have found a way to follow orders without the bloodshed. If I was just too rigid, too—" "Stop." Sarah's voice was firm. "You saw something wrong and you stood against it. That takes more courage than following orders." She smiled slightly. "Seems we're both outcasts, in our way. You for having too much conscience, me for having too much spine." Jonas found himself smiling back. "Quite a pair. The boss who won't give orders and the cook who won't take them." Sarah laughed. "No wonder the men don't know what to make of us." The storm continued to rage, but inside the little shack, a different kind of warmth was building. They talked as the hours passed about small things and large, about dreams deferred and roads not taken. Sarah told him about growing up poor in Boston, losing her parents to fever, making her way west because it was the only place someone like her could breathe. Jonas spoke of his family's farm in Ohio, how he'd left seeking adventure and found only disillusionment. "I used to think I'd have a different life by now," Sarah admitted. "Husband, children, little house somewhere civilized. Then I realized I'd have to give up too much of myself to fit into that life. So here I am, 30 years old, scandalizing decent folks from here to Colorado." 27, Jonas corrected. "What?" "You said you were 30. You're 27. You told Charlie your birthday was in March, which makes you 27. Sarah stared at him. "You remembered that?" Jonas shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I pay attention. Most people don't, not to someone like me." Sarah's voice was wondering. "I'm just the hired help, the wild woman who causes trouble. You're more than that." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The fire had died down to embers, casting everything in a soft red glow. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, the thunder moving off to the east. Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the small window. "Rain's letting up. We should be able to head back soon." Jonas rose as well, feeling the moment slipping away. "Sarah, don't—" She turned to face him. "Don't say whatever you're thinking of saying. This tonight it's just the storm. 2 people finding shelter. Tomorrow we go back to the real world, where you're the boss and I'm the cook who won't last the season." "You're wrong," Jonas said quietly. "You will last the season, and longer, if you want." Sarah's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "We'll see." She began gathering her things. "We should check on the horses." They worked in silence, preparing to leave their temporary shelter. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Stars were beginning to appear between the breaking clouds. As they mounted up, Sarah said, "Jonas, thank you for tonight, for listening." "Any time," he replied, meaning it. They rode back to camp through the wet grass, the horses picking their way carefully in the darkness. Neither spoke, but the silence was comfortable now, weighted with understanding. The camp appeared before them, lanterns glowing like fireflies. The men would be worried, would have questions. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges: ornery cattle, difficult terrain, the constant work of the drive. But tonight, something had shifted. In a rough shack during a storm, 2 solitary souls had found a moment of connection. It might not last, the world had a way of crushing such fragile things, but for now, it was enough. As they dismounted near the chuck wagon, Sarah touched Jonas's arm briefly. "Your secret's safe with me," she said quietly. "About the cavalry." "And yours with me," he replied. "All of them." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "Good night, Jonas." "Good night, Sarah." As she walked away to her tent, Jonas stood in the darkness, watching. The storm had passed, but he had a feeling the real tempest was just beginning, because somewhere between the lightning strikes and the dying fire, he'd realized something that complicated everything. Sarah Callahan wasn't just his cook anymore. She was becoming something much more dangerous, someone he cared about. And in their hard, unforgiving world, caring was perhaps the biggest risk of all. But as he headed to his own bedroll, Jonas found he didn't regret it. Some risks, he was learning, were worth taking. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks into the drive. On a blazing afternoon when the heat shimmered off the ground like water, Jonas was riding point, squinting against the sun, when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon, too big for a single rider, too organized for a buffalo herd. "Riders coming," he called to Frank, who was working the left flank. "Maybe a dozen." Frank stood in his stirrups, shading his eyes. That's a fair number for a social call. Jonas's instincts, honed by years in the cavalry, were screaming warnings. He turned his horse and galloped back to where Sarah was driving the chuck wagon. her rifle propped beside her on the seat. "Company coming," he said tersely. "Stay close to the wagon. Keep that rifle handy." Sarah's eyes sharpened. Trouble. Maybe not. But his hand was already checking his Colt. "Just be ready." The riders appeared over a low rise, spreading out in a loose line as they approached. Jonas recognized the formation designed to look casual while maintaining tactical advantage. His stomach tightened when he saw the man leading them. Clay Harlan hadn't changed much in 4 years. Still had the same cruel mouth, the same dead eyes, the same way of sitting his horse like he owned the world. His dark beard was fuller now, streaked with gray, and he wore his guns tied down like a man who used them regular. Well, Clay drawled, reining up just outside comfortable talking distance. "Jonas Miller, heard you were running cattle through these parts." "Clay." Jonas kept his voice neutral. "Didn't know you were in Wyoming." "Oh, I've got interests all over the territory now." Clay's smile was all teeth. No warmth. "Cattle, mainly. Sometimes I buy 'em. Sometimes I find 'em." The threat was plain. Jonas heard his men shifting behind him, hands moving to weapons. The cattle, sensing tension, began to mill restlessly. "These cattle are legally mine," Jonas said evenly. "Bill of sale back at the camp if you'd care to see it." "Now, I wasn't questioning your ownership, Jonas, just making conversation." Clay's eyes shifted past Jonas to the chuck wagon. "Though I am curious about that wild woman you supposedly hired. Boys in Millbrook said she was something to see." Jonas saw Sarah stiffen on the wagon seat, her hand moving casually to her rifle. "My employees aren't your concern?" "Clay, everything in this territory is my concern." The pretense of friendliness dropped from Clay's voice. "You'd do well to remember that. Man traveling with just 6 cowboys, pushing 50 head through open country. Accidents can happen." "They can," Jonas agreed. "Course, accidents can happen to anyone, even men who ride in packs like coyotes." Clay's hand twitched toward his gun, but he caught himself. His men shifted restlessly, waiting for a signal. The moment stretched taut as wire. Then Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Coffee's on if anyone's interested. Though I should warn you, I make it strong enough to float a horseshoe." Everyone turned to stare at her. She sat on the wagon seat, calm as Sunday morning, but Jonas noticed her rifle was now across her lap, pointed in Clay's general direction. Clay laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So you're the famous Sarah Callahan, the woman who thinks she's too good for civilized company." "I keep the company I choose," Sarah replied coolly. "And I choose not to associate with men who find cattle that don't belong to them." The insult was clear. Clay's face darkened. "You've got a sharp tongue, woman. Someone ought to teach you manners." "Many have tried." Sarah smiled sweetly. "Would you like to see my collection of their teeth?" Despite the danger, Jonas almost smiled. Trust Sarah to face down a dozen armed men with nothing but brass and wit. Clay studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Jonas. "This isn't over, Miller. You're a long way from anywhere, and the territory's a dangerous place. Your woman there might find herself in need of protection." "I protect what's mine," Jonas said quietly. "Always have." "We'll see about that." Clay wheeled his horse around. "Boys, let's ride. The smell around here's getting a bit ripe." They galloped off in a cloud of dust, but Jonas knew they wouldn't go far. Men like Clay Harlan were like buzzards they'd circle, wait for weakness, then strike. "Charming friends you have," Sarah observed once they were out of earshot. "Clay and I served together briefly. He was drummed out for selling army supplies to smugglers." Jonas dismounted, checking the horizon. "He's been running rustling operations ever since. And now he's got his eyes on our cattle." "Our cattle?" Jonas raised an eyebrow. Sarah flushed slightly. "Your cattle? I just meant I'm invested in getting them to market too." My pay depends on it. Right. Your pay. Jonas moved closer to the wagon. Sarah, what you did back there was foolish. I know. But men like that, they're like mean dogs. Show fear and they'll tear you apart. I was going to say it was brave. Their eyes met and held for a moment before Charlie came riding up fast. Boss, we got problems. Looks like they're making camp about 2 miles east, right along our path to water. Jonas cursed under his breath. The nearest water was at Willow Creek, and Clay knew it. They could try to go around, but that would add days to the journey and stress the cattle. Double the night watch, he ordered. And nobody rides alone from here on. That evening, the camp was subdued. Word had spread about Clay Harlan, and the men knew what it meant. Sarah served supper beans and biscuits with dried beef, but even her cooking couldn't lighten the mood. Maybe we should turn back, Eli suggested. Find another route. Turn back and they'll just follow. Hank said, men like that don't give up easy. We push through. Jonas decided, stay alert, stay together. They want us scared and scattered. We don't give them that. What about Miss Sarah? Charlie asked. If they come for the cattle, she'll be right in the middle of it with the wagon. I can take care of myself, Sarah said sharply. No offense, ma'am, but Clay Harlan ain't some drunk cowboy in a boarding house. He's killed men for looking at him wrong. Then I'll be sure not to look at him wrong, Sarah replied. But Jonas heard the tension beneath her bravado. After the men had turned in, Jonas found Sarah cleaning her rifle by the dying fire. You should get some sleep, he said. Can't, too wound up. She ran the cleaning rod through the barrel with practiced ease. That man Clay, there's something personal between you two. More than just Army history. Jonas sat down beside her. We were both interested in the same woman once. She chose me. Clay didn't take it well. What happened to her? She died. Fever. 2 winters after we married. Clay showed up at the funeral. Said it was God's way of making things right. Jonas's jaw tightened. I broke his nose. Haven't seen him since until today. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. About your wife. It was a long time ago. Doesn't make it hurt less. She set her rifle aside. Jonas, I need to tell you something. The real reason I left Colorado wasn't just about the job. There was a man there, similar to Clay. He wanted things I wasn't willing to give. When I refused, he made threats. Said he'd make sure I never worked again. Never had peace. She stared into the fire. I thought running would solve it, but men like that, they're everywhere, aren't they? Not everywhere. Jonas said, and you're not running now? No, she agreed. I'm not. Maybe I'm tired of running. Or maybe. She looked at him. Maybe I finally found something worth standing still for. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Jonas wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but he held back. This wasn't the time, not with danger circling them like wolves. We'll get through this, he said instead. Clay's a bully, but he's also a coward. He won't risk a direct fight unless he's sure he can win. And if he becomes sure, then we make him regret it. Sarah smiled, a fierce expression. I like the sound of that. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. Or maybe it wasn't coyotes at all. Jonas stood, checking his pistol. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Jonas, Sarah called as he walked away. Thank you for not treating me like some helpless female who needs protecting. You're not helpless, he said simply. But that doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. He left her by the fire, but he didn't go to his bedroll. Instead, he found a spot on a low rise where he could watch the eastern horizon. Somewhere out there, Clay Harlan was planning his next move. Jonas had faced Cheyenne warriors and Confederate cavalry. He'd stood against his own commanding officer rather than participate in a massacre. But this felt different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line. His men depended on him. And Sarah was becoming something he couldn't quite name but couldn't bear to lose. The stars wheeled overhead. Indifferent to human troubles, Jonas settled in for a long watch, rifle across his knees. Whatever Clay had planned, they'd be ready. They had to be. In the distance, a flicker of light appeared, a campfire, maybe, or a signal. Jonas marked its position and kept watching. The real test was coming. And when it did, they'd need every ounce of courage and cunning they possessed. Because in the lawless expanse of Wyoming territory, justice came at the barrel of a gun, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. But Jonas Miller had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it involved protecting what was his. And whether she knew it or not, Sarah Callahan had become something worth fighting for. The attack came at 3 a.m, when the fire had died to embers and most of the men were deep in exhausted sleep. Jonas was on watch with Red when he heard it, the thunder of hooves. Too many and too fast to be anything but trouble. "Raiders," he shouted, firing his rifle into the air. "Everyone up, they're coming for the herd." The camp erupted into chaos. Men stumbled from their bedrolls, grabbing weapons and boots in the darkness. The cattle, spooked by the gunfire and approaching riders, began to mill and bellow. Clay Harlan's men came out of the darkness like demons, firing into the air and whooping to scatter the herd. Jonas counted at least 15 riders, maybe more. Muzzle flashes lit the night like deadly fireflies. "Hold the camp," Jonas ordered, firing at the nearest rider. "Don't let them split us up." But it was already too late for young Charlie. Jonas saw him try to head off a group of riders pushing toward the cattle. A shot rang out, and Charlie toppled from his horse. He hit the ground and didn't move. "Charlie!" Frank's anguished cry cut through the noise, but there was no time to help. The raiders were everywhere, and the cattle were beginning to stampede. Jonas fought his way toward the chuck wagon, where Sarah had taken cover. She was firing steadily, her rifle cracking in measured rhythm. A raider who'd gotten too close to the wagon cried out and fell from his saddle. "We need to fall back," Hank shouted, blood streaming from a graze on his temple. "There's too many." "No," Jonas shot back. "We hold here or we lose everything." Through the melee, he spotted Clay Harlan, sitting his horse at a safe distance, directing his men like a general. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and Clay touched his hat brim in mocking salute. Then disaster struck. One of the raiders had brought torches, and suddenly the chuck wagon was ablaze. Sarah barely had time to grab her rifle and jump clear before the flames engulfed her, rolling home. "The supplies!" Eli yelled, but it was hopeless. The fire spread quickly, fed by the dry wood and the flour stores. Within minutes, the wagon was a pillar of flame that lit the entire area. The light was both blessing and curse. They could see the raiders now, but the raiders could see them too. Jonas organized his remaining men into a defensive position behind some rocks, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Sarah appeared at his elbow, her face smudged with soot and dirt. "Charlie." "I know." His voice was grim. "Can't help him now." A bullet whined past, chipping rock near Sarah's head. She ducked, cursing creatively. "We can't hold them much longer." She was right. Red was bleeding from a wound in his side. Eli's left arm hung useless, and they were almost out of ammunition. The cattle were gone, scattered to the four winds. Everything Jonas had worked for was disappearing into the night. "Miller," Clay Harlan's voice carried over the gunfire. "You ready to talk terms?" "Go to hell, Clay." "Now, that's not very Christian of you. Jonas, I'm offering you a way out. You and your men ride away. Leave the woman, and nobody else has to die tonight." Sarah stiffened beside him. "Don't you dare." "Not happening." Jonas called back. "Then you're a fool." Clay's voice turned ugly. "You think she's worth dying for a woman like that? She's not respectable. Miller, she's just a—" Sarah's rifle cracked, and Clay's hat flew off his head. "The next one goes between your eyes," she shouted. The firing intensified, but Jonas could tell his men were flagging. They needed a miracle, or they were all dead. The miracle came from an unexpected source. Just as Jonas was preparing for a last, desperate charge, new gunfire erupted from the east. Fresh riders poured over the rise, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jonas thought Clay had even more men. Then he heard a familiar voice.
"That's my nephew you shot, you bastards!"
It was Sam Henderson from the general store, leading a posse of townsmen from Dust Creek. Tom Garrett was there, and the banker John Morrison, and at least 10 others. They slammed into Clay's men from the flank, catching them completely by surprise. The tide turned in seconds. Caught between two forces, the raiders began to retreat. Clay Harlan, seeing his advantage evaporate, spurred his horse and fled into the darkness, his remaining men following.
"Let them go,"
Jonas called as some of the townsmen prepared to give chase. "See to the wounded." The next hour was a blur of activity. By the light of the burning wagon, they tended injuries and counted losses. Charlie Dawson was dead, shot through the chest. 2 of Clay's men hadn't made it out. Red's wound was serious but not fatal, while Eli's arm was broken but would heal. "How?" Jonas asked Sam Henderson as Sarah bandaged a cut on his forehead. "How did you know?" Sam looked embarrassed. "Tom and I had a bad feeling after you left town that Clay Harlan's been causing trouble all over the territory. We figured you might need help, so we followed at a distance. Heard the gunfire and came running. You saved our lives. You'd have done the same?" Sam looked around at the devastation. "Though I'm sorry we weren't faster. That boy didn't deserve to die." Jonas looked to where they'd wrapped Charlie in a blanket. 19 years old, full of dreams about seeing California. Now he'd never leave Wyoming. None of this was deserved, Sarah said quietly. She stood surveying the smoldering remains of the chuck wagon. Everything she owned had been in there, her few possessions, her cooking supplies, the small stash of money she'd been saving. "I'll replace everything," Jonas promised. She shook her head. "Things can be replaced. Charlie can't." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving more soot streaks. "That bastard Harlan, he planned this. Waited until we were vulnerable." "He won't get away with it," Tom Garrett said. "We'll wire the marshal in Cheyenne. Put a price on his head." But Jonas knew better. Men like Clay had been operating in the territories for years. The law was spread thin, and witnesses had a way of disappearing or forgetting what they saw. As dawn broke, they took stock of the full damage. The cattle were scattered across miles of range. It would take days to round them up, if they could be found at all. The chuck wagon was destroyed, along with most of their supplies, and they'd lost Charlie. "It's over," Eli said, cradling his broken arm. "Without supplies, without a full crew, we can't make the drive." The men looked to Jonas, waiting for him to make the call. He could see defeat in their eyes, the recognition that Clay Harlan had won. They'd fought hard, but it hadn't been enough. "Boss," Frank said quietly, "maybe we should—" "No." Sarah's voice cut through their despair. She stood up, shoulders squared despite her exhaustion. "We're not quitting." "Miss Sarah," Hank said gently, "we appreciate the spirit, but we got no food, no wagon." "Then we make do. I can cook over an open fire as well as a stove. We'll hunt for meat, forage for what we can. As for the cattle, they couldn't have gone far. We round them up and push on." "And Clay?" Red asked from where he lay. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "Clay Harlan thinks he won. He's wrong. He killed that boy, destroyed property, tried to steal honest men's livelihood. Where I come from, we don't let that stand." She turned to Jonas. "You hired me to feed your crew and get these cattle to market. I intend to do just that, with or without a proper kitchen. Question is, are you men enough to see it through?" The challenge in her words sparked something in the defeated cowboys. Hank straightened. "I ain't never quit a job in my life." Me neither, Frank added. And Charlie would hate it if we gave up because of him. One by one, the men nodded agreement. Even Eli, pessimistic Eli, managed a grim smile. Guess we're still driving cattle. Jonas felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, gratitude, and something deeper when he looked at Sarah, this woman who'd lost everything but refused to bend. "Sam," he said to the merchant, "can you spare some supplies? I'll pay double when we get back." Already loading a wagon, Sam replied, "And no charge. This is neighbors helping neighbors." As the sun climbed higher, they prepared Charlie for burial. They chose a spot on a hill overlooking the valley, where he could watch the sunrise forever. Sarah sang Amazing Grace in a clear, strong voice that carried across the plains. There wasn't a dry eye when she finished. "He was a good kid," Jonas said over the grave. "Worked hard, never complained. He died protecting what was right. Can't ask for more than that." They marked the grave with stones and a wooden cross Frank carved with Charlie's name. Then, because life demanded it, they turned to the task of rebuilding. By noon, they'd recovered about half the cattle. The townsmen helped with the roundup before heading back to Dust Creek. Tom Garrett pulled Jonas aside before leaving. "That woman of yours," he said. "I was wrong about her. She's got more grit than most men I know." "She's not my woman," Jonas corrected automatically. Tom gave him a knowing look. "Maybe not yet, but a man would be a fool not to try." He mounted his horse. "Watch your back. Jonas, Clay won't forget this. He'll come again." "Let him come," Jonas said. "We'll be ready." As the rescue party disappeared over the horizon, Jonas surveyed his battered but unbroken crew. They'd lost much, but they'd gained something too, a unity forged in fire and blood. Sarah was already organizing the remaining supplies, ordering the men around with her usual sharp efficiency. But Jonas caught her pausing now and then, staring at the burned wagon or Charlie's grave with an expression of profound sadness. "We'll make it," he said, moving to stand beside her. "I know," she managed a tired smile. "I just wish—" "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They stood together in silent remembrance. Two people who'd seen too much loss but refused to let it break them. Around them, the work continued. The drive would go on, because that's what Charlie would have wanted. That's what they all needed. Clay Harlan had tried to destroy them. He'd failed. And when they finally reached market, when these cattle were sold and the men paid, Jonas would settle accounts. Justice might be scarce in the territory, but it wasn't extinct. Not while people like Sarah Callahan stood ready to fight for it. The journey to Dust Creek took 2 days with the wounded. Red couldn't sit a horse with his side wound, so they'd rigged a travois behind Frank's mount. Eli rode with his arm in a sling Sarah had fashioned from her own torn petticoat. The remaining cattle, barely 30 head, moved slowly, as beaten down as their handlers. Jonas rode ahead as they approached town, wanting to gauge the mood before bringing in his battered crew. What he found made his blood run cold. The main street was too quiet for midday. Shops were shuttered, and the few people about scurried between buildings like mice avoiding a hawk. Jonas spotted Tom Garrett sweeping the boardwalk in front of the broken wheel, and rode over. "Tom, what's going on?" The bartender glanced around nervously before answering. "Clay Harlan's been here. Came in yesterday with 20 men. They've taken over the Oriental Saloon. And Clay's been throwing money around, buying drinks and loyalty." The Marshal. Tom's laugh was bitter. "Marshal went to visit his sick mother in Denver. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say, and Sheriff Briggs—" He spat into the street. "Briggs is sitting in the Oriental right now, drinking Clay's whiskey." Jonas felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Clay hadn't just regrouped, he'd seized control of the town. Has he hurt anyone? Not yet, but he's made it clear what happens to anyone who helps you. Sam Henderson's locked himself in his store, and the mayor's suddenly decided to take a business trip. Tom met Jonas's eyes. You can't bring your people here. It's not safe. Where else can we go? I've got wounded men who need the doctor. Doc Peterson's still here, but he's been warned not to treat anyone from your outfit. Tom glanced around again. Listen, there's an old barn about a mile north. Belongs to Widow Morrison. She's no friend of Clay's. He tried to buy her land last year and she ran him off with a shotgun. She might let you hole up there. Jonas nodded his thanks and rode back to intercept his crew. They'd have to go around town. Avoid being seen. As he explained the situation, he watched his men's faces fall. Even Sarah's indomitable spirit seemed to dim. So we're outlaws now, Frank asked bitterly. In our own town. Just until we figure out our next move, Jonas said, though he had no idea what that might be. The Morrison barn was sturdy but hadn't been used in years. Widow Morrison, a fierce woman in her 70s, met them with a shotgun before recognizing Jonas. Heard what happened, she said, lowering the weapon. That Harlan's a snake. You're welcome to the barn, but I can't offer more. He's got men watching my place. They made camp as best they could. Sarah worked miracles with their meager supplies, but Jonas could see the strain wearing on everyone. They were exhausted, wounded, and now effectively exiled. That evening, Sarah found Jonas standing watch outside the barn. We can't stay here, she said without preamble. I know. The men need proper medical attention. Red's wound is getting infected, and Eli's arm needs to be properly set. She wrapped her shawl tighter against the cool night air. And we need supplies if we're going to make another attempt at the drive. Clay's counting on that. The moment we show ourselves in town. Then we don't all show ourselves. Sarah's eyes glinted in the moonlight. He's focused on you and the men, but me, I'm just the hired cook, the wild woman nobody respects. Jonas saw where she was going. Absolutely not. Listen before you refuse. I can go into town, gauge the situation, maybe rally some support. There have to be people who aren't happy about Clay taking over. And if he recognizes you, if someone tells him who you are, Sarah smiled grimly, then I'll handle it my way. Sarah? You have a better plan. She waited, but Jonas had nothing. I'll go at first light, visit the general store, the doctor, maybe stop by the saloon, just a woman doing errands, nothing suspicious. Jonas wanted to forbid it, but he knew she was right. They needed information and allies, and Sarah was their best chance. Take Frank with you. He can watch your back. That defeats the purpose. A woman alone is overlooked. A woman with an armed escort draws attention. They argued for another hour, but Sarah was immovable. Finally, Jonas agreed, though it felt like swallowing glass. First sign of trouble, you get out. Of course, Sarah said, though they both knew she was lying. The next morning, Sarah transformed herself. She borrowed a demure dress from Widow Morrison, pinned her hair in a respectable bun, and even managed to look meek. It was unsettling how different she appeared. Remember, Jonas said as she prepared to leave, we need information more than supplies. Don't take unnecessary risks. Sarah patted the derringer hidden in her skirts. I never do. The hours of her absence were the longest of Jonas's life. He paced, checked on the wounded, paced some more. The men tried to act casual, but tension filled the barn like smoke. It was past noon when she returned, driving a small wagon loaded with supplies. But Jonas's relief turned to alarm when he saw her split lip and the bruise forming on her cheek. What happened? I'm fine. She waved off his concern, though he noticed she moved stiffly. And I bring interesting news. The men gathered around as Sarah unpacked medical supplies, fresh bandages, and food. First, Doc Peterson sends his regards. He can't come himself, but he sent instructions for treating Red's wound and Eli's arm. Also sent laudanum for the pain. How did you... His wife answered the door. Seems the good doctor was conveniently called away. But Mrs. Peterson has opinions about men who threaten healers. Sarah smiled despite her split lip. She was quite helpful. The supplies? Frank asked. Sam Henderson's wife. Amazing how cooperative people become when their menfolk aren't watching. Sarah's expression darkened. But that's not the important news. Clay's planning something bigger. I overheard 2 of his men talking in the Oriental. What kind of something? Jonas demanded. He's not content with just your cattle anymore. He's planning to take over the whole territory's cattle trade. Already has agreements with corrupt buyers in Cheyenne. Any rancher who won't sell to him at his prices will find their herds mysteriously disappearing. Son of a... Hank caught himself. Pardon, Miss Sarah. I've heard worse. Said worse. In fact, when one of Clay's men cornered me behind the store. She touched her bruised cheek. He thought I'd be easy prey. He learned different. Sarah. Jonas's hands clenched into fists. I handled it. Left him bleeding in the alley. Nothing fatal, but here's the thing while he was trying to intimidate me. He let slip that not everyone in town is happy with Clay's takeover. The smaller ranchers, the honest merchants, even some of the saloon girls are fed up. They're just too scared to act. Fear's a powerful motivator, Eli said from his makeshift bed. So is anger, Sarah countered. And I saw plenty of that. Mrs. Henderson told me the mayor didn't leave town voluntarily. Clay's men escorted him to the stage. And Sheriff Briggs, he's drinking himself stupid because he knows he's sold his soul. None of that helps us, Frank pointed out. Clay's got the guns and the numbers. For now. Sarah pulled out a piece of paper. But Mrs. Peterson gave me this. It's a list of men who might stand with us if push came to shove. Ranchers Clay hasn't bought yet. Townsmen with backbone. Even a few drifters who don't like bullies. Jonas studied the list. Maybe 15 names, 20 at most. Against Clay's force, it wouldn't be enough. We'd need more than this. Then we get more. Sarah's voice was fierce. Jonas, you're thinking like a soldier force against force. But this isn't a military campaign. It's about justice, about community. Clay's trying to rule through fear. We need to give people something stronger than fear. Hope, Jonas said skeptically. Anger, righteousness, the knowledge that they're not alone. Sarah stood, wincing slightly. I told several people to spread the word. Anyone who's tired of Clay Harlan's reign of terror should be at Widow Morrison's church tomorrow night. We'll see who shows up. You arranged a meeting without discussing it with me. Would you have agreed? Jonas had to admit she had a point. His instinct was to protect, to avoid confrontation until they were stronger. But Sarah understood something he didn't. Sometimes the fight came whether you were ready or not. That night, Jonas insisted on doctoring Sarah's injuries himself. As he cleaned the cut on her lip, she told him what really happened in town. It was 3 of them, not 1, she admitted quietly. They knew who I was, were waiting for me. Said Clay had special plans for the woman who dared shoot at him. Jonas's hand stilled. 3? I'm not helpless. Remember, though I'll admit, it was closer than I like. She caught his hand. But I learned something important. Clay's afraid. That's why he's pushing so hard. Why he came to town instead of just taking the cattle and running. He knows you're not the type to let this go. He needs to crush you completely. Make an example. Maybe he's right to be afraid, Jonas said darkly. Sarah studied his face. The soldier's coming back. Isn't he the one who stood against his commander? That was different. That was about right and wrong. And this isn't... She touched his cheek gently. Jonas, I know you want to protect everyone, but sometimes protection means standing up and fighting, even when the odds are bad. Charlie's already dead because of my fight with Clay. Charlie's dead because Clay Harlan's a murderer and a thief. Don't you dare take that on yourself. Her green eyes flashed. And don't you dare give up. Not when we've come this far. Jonas caught her hand, held it. I'm not giving up. I can't lose anyone else. I can't lose you. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah's breath caught. and for a moment, the walls they'd both built wavered. Then she pulled back, the moment breaking. "You won't lose me. I'm too stubborn to die." She managed a smile. "Now, let's plan for tomorrow. If people show up to this meeting, we need to be ready." They talked strategy until late, but Jonas's mind kept circling back to that moment. In the middle of all this chaos, with death and danger on every side, he'd gone and done the most dangerous thing possible. He'd fallen in love with Sarah Callahan. The question was what to do about it, and whether they'd live long enough for it to matter. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. Either the town would rally to their cause, or they'd face Clay Harlan alone. But tonight, in a drafty barn with wounded men and uncertain future, Jonas allowed himself one moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, David could still defeat Goliath, especially with someone like Sarah throwing the stones. The church at Widow Morrison's property was small and weathered, paint peeling from its walls like old skin. Jonas positioned his men carefully, Frank at the back door, Hank watching the road. Eli, despite his broken arm, stationed at a window. They couldn't be too careful, not with Clay's men everywhere. "Could be a trap," Red said from where he sat, his wound still tender but healing thanks to Doc Peterson's medicine. "Everything's a trap these days," Sarah replied, arranging benches to accommodate whoever might come, if anyone came at all. As darkness fell, Jonas began to think no one would show. Then he heard horses, single riders approaching cautiously, taking different paths. The first to arrive was Ben Talbert, a small rancher from the North Valley. "Heard there was a meeting," Ben said quietly, hat in hand, about the Harlan problem. Soon others trickled in. Mary Patterson, who ran the boarding house, Jim Crawford and his 2 sons, wheat farmers who'd lost cattle to mysterious raids. Even Tom Garrett slipped in, looking nervously over his shoulder. By 8 o'clock, 23 people had gathered, more than Jonas had dared hope, but fewer than they needed. Sarah stood at the front, and Jonas watched the townspeople's surprise at seeing a woman taking charge. "I know what you're thinking," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly. "What can we do against Clay Harlan's gang? They have guns, numbers, the sheriff in their pocket." She paused. "But they don't have what we have the right to live free from fear in our own town." "Fine words," called out Jim Crawford. "But words won't stop bullets." "No, but courage might." Sarah's eyes swept the room. "How many of you have lost cattle, had property damaged, been threatened for just trying to run your business?" Hands rose slowly around the room. "And how many more will suffer if we do nothing? Clay Harlan isn't content with stealing from Jonas Miller. He wants to control everything, your ranches, your shops, your lives." "What are you proposing?" Mary Patterson asked. "We can't match his firepower." Jonas stepped forward. "We don't need to match it. We need to be smarter. Clay's expecting a straight fight, but we give him something else." "Like what?" Ben Talbert demanded. "Information." Jonas said, "Clay's men drink in your saloons, buy from your stores. You see things, hear things. We pool that knowledge, find their weaknesses. And then," Sarah smiled grimly, "then we set a trap. Clay thinks he's the hunter, but hunters can become the hunted." The room erupted in discussion. Some were eager for action, others fearful of reprisals. Jonas let them talk, gauging the mood. These people were scared, but also angry, a combination that could go either way. "I've got something to say." Tom Garrett stood up. 3 nights ago, I heard Clay's men talking. They're planning to hit the Crawford farm next. Something about Jim here refusing to sell at Clay's price. Jim Crawford's face went white. "When?" "Tomorrow night. They figure to burn your barn, scatter your stock, make an example. We could be ready for them," Hank suggested. "Turn their ambush around." "With what men?" someone called out. "Half of us can barely shoot straight." "I can teach you," Sarah said quietly, and the room went silent. "Some of you know my reputation. Yes, I can shoot. Yes, I've had to defend myself. And yes, I'll teach anyone who wants to learn.
A woman teaching men to fight? Ben Talbert scoffed.
Sarah's hand moved faster than thought, and suddenly her derringer was pointed at Ben's hat. The shot was impossibly loud in the small church. Ben's hat flew off his head, a neat hole through the crown. "Any other questions about what a woman can teach?" Sarah asked calmly, reloading. The silence was profound. Then Mary Patterson stood up. "I want to learn. Lost my husband to raiders 5 years ago. Swore I'd never be helpless again."
"Me too," said one of the Crawford boys.
Others began nodding, murmuring agreement. Jonas felt a surge of pride and worry in equal measure. Sarah had turned the tide, but at what cost every person here was now marked if Clay found out. They spent the next hour planning. The Crawford farm would be their battleground, but they needed to be clever about it. Jonas outlined defensive positions while Sarah organized groups for training. Tom Garrett volunteered to keep his ears open at the saloon. Others offered what they could: ammunition, food, medical supplies. As the meeting broke up, people left as carefully as they'd come, spacing their departures. Jonas noticed something had changed in their bearing. They walked a little straighter, met eyes instead of looking away. Hope was dangerous in times like these, but it was also powerful. "That was risky," Jonas said to Sarah after everyone had gone. "Showing off like that." "They needed to see strength," she replied. "Too long they've seen only Clay's version of it, brutality and fear. I showed them something different." "You showed them you," Jonas said softly. Sarah looked at him, something vulnerable in her eyes. "Is that so bad?" Before Jonas could answer, Hank burst through the door.
"Riders coming 6, maybe 7.
Everyone moved fast. Jonas and Frank took positions at the windows while Sarah helped Red into hiding. Eli grabbed his rifle awkwardly with his good arm. The riders stopped just outside the church. Jonas recognized Clay's voice immediately. "I know you're in there. Miller saw the horses, tracked the people leaving." Clay laughed. "A meeting. Was it planning revolution?" "Just a prayer gathering." Jonas called back. "You're welcome to join us. Clay, Lord knows you need it." "Funny, man. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come out, nice and peaceful. We'll finish our business, and these good people can go back to their lives. And if I don't, then we burn the church, with everyone in it." Sarah appeared at Jonas's elbow, rifle in hand. "He's bluffing. Too many witnesses." "Maybe." Jonas studied the shadows outside. Clay had positioned his men well, covering all exits. "But can we risk it?" "Jonas," Frank whispered urgently. "There's movement to the south. More riders." Jonas's heart sank. Reinforcements. They were trapped. Then the new riders emerged into the moonlight, and Jonas blinked in surprise. It was Ben Talbert, the man whose hat Sarah had shot. With him were 4 other ranchers, all armed. "Evening, Harlan," Ben called out. "Heard there was some kind of disturbance. Thought we'd check on the widow Morrison's property." "This isn't your concern, Talbert. See, that's where you're wrong." More shadows moved, and Jonas saw Jim Crawford and his sons taking positions. "Everything in this valley concerns us. We're neighbors, after all." Clay's men shifted nervously. The odds had just evened considerably. "You people are making a mistake." Clay snarled. "You know what I can do. We know what you have done." Mary Patterson's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. "And we're tired of it." For a tense moment, Jonas thought Clay would order an attack anyway. Then, with a curse that would have made a mule skinner blush, Clay wheeled his horse around.
"This isn't over, Miller."
"Not by a long shot." He spurred his horse, his men following. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Jonas emerged from the church. The townspeople began to gather, faces flushed with their small victory. "He'll be back," Jonas warned, and angry. "Let him come." Ben Talbert said, "We've run once from him already tonight. Not again." "Why did you come back?" Sarah asked. Ben touched his ventilated hat. "Figured anyone who could shoot like that was worth following. Besides," he grinned sheepishly, "my wife would never let me hear the end of it if I let a woman show more courage than me." They made plans quickly. The Crawford farm was definitely a trap now. Clay would expect them there. They needed a new strategy. "What about the canyon?" Jim Crawford suggested. "Harlan's been using Box Canyon to hold stolen cattle. It's isolated, defendable. And a perfect place for an ambush," Jonas finished. "If we could draw him there." They talked until dawn, refining the plan. It was risky. Required precise timing and more courage than was reasonable. But it might work. As the sun rose, Jonas found Sarah sitting on the church steps, cleaning her rifle. She looked exhausted but determined. "You changed things tonight," he said, sitting beside her. "Gave them something to believe in." "I gave them permission to fight back. There's a difference." She glanced at him. "You're the one they'll follow when it counts. The soldier who stands for justice." "We'll see about that." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, when this is over..." "Don't," she stood abruptly. "Don't make promises or plans. Not yet. Too much can happen." Jonas stood too, catching her arm gently. "I'm not good at waiting." "Then learn." But she softened the words with a smile. "We have a war to win first. Jonas Miller, everything else." She shrugged. "Everything else can wait." She was right. Jonas knew. But watching her walk away, rifle over her shoulder and dawn light catching her hair, he wondered how much waiting a man could do before going crazy. The next 24 hours would test them all. Clay Harlan had been challenged openly, his authority questioned. He would respond with violence that was his nature. But for the first time since this started, Jonas felt they had a real chance. They had numbers now, and determination. They had Sarah's fierce spirit and the town's awakened courage. Most importantly, they had something Clay's money couldn't buy: the righteous anger of people pushed too far. The final confrontation was coming. Jonas could feel it like electricity in the air. Tomorrow, at Box Canyon, they would end this one way or another. Justice or death, freedom or failure. Jonas checked his weapons and prepared for war. But his last thought before exhaustion claimed him was of green eyes and red hair, and a woman brave enough to stand against the world. Tomorrow would bring the storm. Tonight, he allowed himself to hope they'd survive it. The dawn came slowly to Box Canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Jonas positioned his people carefully, townspeople mixed with his experienced cowboys, creating a network of defenders along the canyon walls. Sarah was with him at the eastern overlook, her rifle ready, her presence steadying. "They'll come from the west," Jonas said, scanning the terrain through his field glasses. "Clay's too smart to ride into a box canyon from the closed end." "Unless he knows it's a trap," Sarah pointed out. "Then he might do exactly what we don't expect." She was right. As usual, Jonas had learned to trust her instincts over the past weeks. "Frank, take 3 men and watch the back trail, just in case." They'd baited the trap carefully. Tom Garrett had let slip in the saloon that Jonas was hiding the recovered cattle in Box Canyon, that he planned to sneak them out tomorrow night. Clay's informants would have carried the news quickly. Now they waited. "Nervous?" Sarah asked quietly. "Always am before a fight." Jonas checked his ammunition for the 10th time. "You..." "Terrified," she admitted with a wry smile. "But don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain." Despite everything, Jonas found himself smiling back. "Your secret's safe with me." A whistle from below Hank's signal. Riders approaching. Jonas counted the dust plumes. 15, maybe 20 men. Clay had brought a small army. "Positions," Jonas called softly. The word passed down the line. Men and women who'd been farmers and shopkeepers yesterday steadied their weapons, faces grim but determined. Clay Harlan rode at the head of his gang, bold as brass. He stopped just inside the canyon mouth, studying the walls suspiciously. Jonas held his breath. If Clay smelled the trap now? But greed won over caution. Clay spotted the small herd of cattle they'd left as bait and smiled. He waved his men forward. They let Clay's gang get deep into the canyon before Jonas fired the first shot. It was a signal shot, high and clear, and suddenly, the canyon erupted. Gunfire rained down from both walls. Clay's men, caught in the open, scrambled for cover. Some fell from their horses immediately. Others managed to find shelter behind rocks, returning fire wildly. "Pour it on!" Jonas shouted, picking his targets carefully. Beside him, Sarah fired with deadly precision. He'd seen her shoot before, but this was different. This was war, and she fought like a warrior. Clay's voice rose above the gunfire. "It's a trap! Fall back! Fall back!" But falling back meant running a gauntlet of fire. The canyon had become a killing ground, just as Jonas had planned. Yet even as Clay's men fell or fled, Jonas felt no satisfaction. This was necessity, not glory. Then everything changed. A group of riders appeared at the canyon's back entrance, the route Frank was supposed to be watching. Jonas's heart sank as he recognized Sheriff Briggs leading them. The corrupt lawman had thrown in completely with Clay. "Behind us!" someone screamed. The defenders on the canyon floor were caught between two forces. Jonas saw Ben Talbert go down, clutching his shoulder. One of the Crawford boys fell and didn't get up. "We need to help them." Sarah started to rise, but Jonas pulled her down as bullets whined overhead. "We can't. We're pinned." The tide was turning. Clay's men, emboldened by reinforcements, pushed forward. The trap was becoming a disaster. Then Jonas heard something that chilled his blood. Sarah's sharp cry of pain. She dropped her rifle, clutching her side where red was already spreading. "Sarah!" Jonas caught her as she swayed. "How bad?" "I'm fine," she gasped, though her face was already pale. "Just a scratch." It was more than a scratch. The bullet had caught her just below the ribs, and blood was flowing too fast. Jonas pressed his kerchief against the wound, his mind racing. They needed to get out, get help, but they were surrounded. "Jonas!" Sarah gripped his arm weakly. "Don't let them win. Not now." Rage filled him then cold. Focused rage. The same feeling he'd had that day in the cavalry when ordered to attack innocents. But this time, the enemy deserved everything coming to them. "Hank," he bellowed. "Take command here, I'm going down." Before anyone could protest, Jonas was moving. He half slid, half ran down the steep canyon side, fury lending him speed and purpose. He hit the canyon floor running, his guns blazing. Clay's men, surprised by this sudden assault, hesitated. Jonas didn't. He moved like death itself, every shot finding its mark. The months of civilized ranching fell away, and he was a soldier again, trained and lethal. "It's Miller!" someone shouted. "Get him!" But Jonas had reached the defender's position, sliding behind cover just as bullets peppered the ground where he'd been. Jim Crawford, bleeding from a scalp wound, looked at him in amazement. That was the damnedest thing I ever saw. "Can you hold here?" Jonas demanded. "If we have to." "You have to." Jonas reloaded swiftly. "I'm going after Clay." He spotted his target, Clay Harlan, sheltering behind an overturned wagon. Shouting orders, the man who'd started all this, who'd killed Charlie, threatened Sarah, terrorized a town. Jonas broke cover again, zigzagging through the battlefield. A bullet tugged at his sleeve, another kicked up dust at his feet. He didn't slow. Clay saw him coming and raised his gun. They fired simultaneously. Clay's shot went wide. Jonas's didn't. The bullet caught Clay in the shoulder, spinning him around. His gun flew from his hand. Jonas closed the distance, kicking the weapon away as Clay scrambled for it. "Get up," Jonas said coldly. Clay struggled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder. "You won't kill an unarmed man, not the noble Jonas Miller." "You're right." Jonas holstered his gun. "I won't shoot an unarmed man." Then he hit Clay with all the rage and grief of the past weeks. His fist connected solidly, sending Clay sprawling. Jonas followed, hauling the man up just to knock him down again. "That's for Charlie," he said, landing another blow. "That's for Sarah. That's for every person you've hurt." Clay tried to fight back, but wounded and facing Jonas's fury, he had no chance. Soon he was on the ground, barely conscious, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. Jonas stood over him, breathing hard. Around them, the gunfire was dying down. Clay's men, seeing their leader fallen, were surrendering or fleeing. Sheriff Briggs was already riding hard for the horizon, his brief career as a corrupt lawman over. "Jonas!" Frank's voice. "We need help up here, it's Sarah!" The rage drained away, replaced by fear. Jonas left Clay groaning in the dirt and ran for the canyon wall. The climb up seemed endless, his boots slipping on loose stone. When he finally reached the top, a circle of people had gathered. Sarah lay still, her face white as paper. Doc Peterson was there. Someone must have fetched him, working frantically. There was so much blood. "Will she?" Jonas couldn't finish the question. "I'm trying," Doc said without looking up. "The bullet's deep, and she's lost a lot of blood. We need to get her to town, to my surgery." They improvised a stretcher, and Jonas helped carry her down. Every jostle made him wince, imagining her pain. She'd drifted into unconsciousness, which Doc said might be a mercy. The ride to town was a blur. Jonas stayed by Sarah's side, holding her hand, whispering words he'd been too cautious to say before. "Stay with me, please, Sarah. I need you to stay." The surgery lasted hours. Jonas paced Doc Peterson's waiting room like a caged animal while the others dealt with the aftermath. Clay Harlan and his surviving men were locked up, awaiting the federal marshal. The townspeople were already talking about elections for a new sheriff. The stolen cattle were being returned to their rightful owners. None of it mattered to Jonas. Only the woman fighting for her life in the next room mattered. It was near sunset when Doc Peterson finally emerged, exhausted and blood-stained. Jonas searched his face desperately for answers. "She's alive," Doc said, and Jonas nearly collapsed with relief. "The bullet's out, and I've stopped the bleeding, but she's weak. The next 24 hours will tell." "Can I see her?" "Briefly, she needs rest." Sarah looked small in the bed. Her fierce spirit temporarily dimmed. Jonas sat carefully beside her, taking her hand. "You rest now," he whispered. "I'll be here when you wake up. I'll always be here." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, green eyes focused on him. "Did we win?" she whispered. "Yeah, we won." "Good." Her fingers squeezed his weakly. "Jonas." "I'm here. When I get better, ask me again." "Ask you what?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Whatever you were going to ask. That night at the church, ask me again." Then she slept, leaving Jonas with hope burning in his chest like a flame. 3 weeks later, Sarah Callahan stood in the same church where they'd planned their resistance. But this time, she wore a borrowed white dress, and the gathered crowd was there for celebration, not war. "Do you, Jonas Miller, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Mitchell asked. Jonas looked at Sarah, still pale from her ordeal, but standing straight and proud. "I do." "And do you, Sarah Callahan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sarah's smile was radiant. "I absolutely do." The cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. The whole town had turned out Ben Talbert with his arm still in a sling. The Crawfords, Mary Patterson, even Widow Morrison looking almost pleasant. As Jonas kissed his bride, He thought about the journey that had brought them here. A desperate rancher hiring a wild cook, violence and loss, courage and community. And through it all, two stubborn people finding something neither had expected a love worth fighting for. Outside, the Wyoming sun shone bright on a town reborn. The cattle were sold, the ranch was rebuilding, and justice had prevailed. It wouldn't always be easy, the frontier never was, but they'd face whatever came together. "So, Mrs. Miller," Jonas said as they walked down the aisle. "Ready for our next adventure?" Sarah laughed. "The sound like music. With you always." They emerged into the sunshine to find Jonas's cowboys waiting with horses. The ranch needed tending, after all, and there was work to be done. But first, there would be a celebration like Dust Creek had never seen. As they rode out of town, Sarah turned in her saddle to look back. The church, the main street, the people who'd become family, all of it bathed in golden light. "No regrets?" Jonas asked. "None," Sarah said firmly. "Though I do have one request." "Anything. Next time we hire a cook, let's find someone a little less wild. I'm retiring from that particular reputation." Jonas grinned. "I don't know. I've grown rather fond of wild." Sarah's laughter echoed across the plains as they rode toward home, toward their future, toward all the adventures yet to come. The cowboy had hired the wildest cook in another town, and found not just his nights, but his whole life, burning brighter for it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed following Jonas and Sarah's journey through the wild frontier. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts about the story. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more exciting Western adventures. Give this video a like. And don't forget to hit that hype button to help more people discover these stories. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the sunset.